The sun over Redemption, Kansas, was a merciless white eye in a bleached canvas of sky. It beat down on the dusty main street, baking the color from the wooden storefronts and drawing shimmering heat devils from the packed earth. Inside the Redemption Bank and Trust, the air was still and cool, thick with the scent of old paper-oiled wood and the faint metallic tang of currency. Samuel McGraw stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders stooped slightly, his weathered hands resting on the polished oak counter. He was a man carved from the land itself, his face a roadmap of sun-creased lines, his eyes the pale distant blue of a winter sky. Just the savings, Mr. Abernathy Samuel, said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed, all of it. The teller, a young man with a pristine collar and a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, blinked. The whole account, Mr. McGraw. Are you sure that's... Well, that's nearly 15 years of deposits. Samuel offered a slow nod. Winter's coming on. Need to buy feed for the herd and repair the north fence line before the first snow. Can't put it off any longer. It was more than that. It was the crushing weight of solitude, the endless silent work that filled his days. The ranch was all he had left of Sarah, a sprawling monument to a life they were supposed to build together. Now it was just a place where memories grew like weeds, beautiful and suffocating. The money was a tool, nothing more, a means to keep the ghosts at bay for another season. Mr. Abernathy began counting out the bills with practiced efficiency, the soft flick of paper a soothing rhythm in the quiet bank. Samuel's gaze drifted to the street outside. A farmer guided his wagon past the wheels, groaning under the weight of autumn gourds. Two women in bonnets paused to chat under the shade of the mercantile's awning. It was a peaceful, ordinary Tuesday. A life he had chosen precisely for its lack of surprises. That peace shattered in an instant. The bank doors burst inward with a splintering crash that echoed like a gunshot. 3 men stormed into the room, and their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, their hands filled with cold black iron. The lead man was tall and wiry, moving with a predator's coiled grace. His eyes cold and sharp above the cloth swept the room, assessing, commanding. "Nobody move." He snarled, his voice a blade cutting through the silence. "This is a robbery. Any heroes in here will be buried before sundown." Panic erupted. A woman shrieked. Mr. Abernathy dropped a stack of bills, his face draining of color. The other 2 robbers, burly and brutish, moved to corral the handful of customers, shoving them toward the back wall. Samuel remained perfectly still, his body rigid. An old forgotten part of him awoke from a long slumber, the part that wore a tin star in Dodge City, the part that knew the smell of gunpowder and the feel of a man's last breath. He had buried that man years ago, right alongside Sarah. The leader vaulted over the counter, his pistol aimed squarely at Mr. Abernathy's trembling chin. The vault. Now, as the robbers focused on the teller, the chaos near the back wall intensified. A young woman, her face a mask of terror, stumbled and fell. She was caught in the path of the panicked customers about to be trampled. Her wide, frightened eyes met Samuel's for a fleeting second. He didn't think, he acted. With a speed that belied his years, Samuel moved his powerful frame, shielding the woman from the surging crowd. He reached down his calloused hand, closing around her arm, and pulled her to her feet, steadying her against the wall. "Stay down," he grunted, his body a bulwark between her and the danger. The sudden movement caught the leader's attention. He spun around, his cold eyes locking onto Samuel. "I said no heroes, old man." He strode toward them, his boots thudding on the pine floorboards. He was close now, close enough for Samuel to see the cruel twist of his lips above the bandana. The leader's gaze flickered down, snagging on the fine silver chain around Samuel's neck. A small, intricately engraved locket rested against his chest. Sarah's locket. The last thing she had touched. Before Samuel could react, the robber's free hand shot out. Fingers like steel talons closed around the chain and yanked. The silver snapped. The locket, his most sacred connection to the past, was gone, swallowed by the man's fist. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The shouting, the crying, the frantic scrabbling for money, it all faded away. There was only the searing void on Samuel's chest and the robber's triumphant, mocking eyes. The man gave a low, cruel chuckle. "A pretty little thing," he sneered. "A token for my troubles." He turned and shouted to his men, "Got the cash, let's ride." They were gone as quickly as they had come, melting back into the blinding sunlight, leaving behind a wake of shattered peace-stolen money and a silence more profound than before. The young woman Samuel had saved was sobbing quietly, her body still pressed against the wall. Samuel barely noticed. His hand went to his neck, his fingers brushing against the raw, empty space where the locket had been. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed had been violated, a wound torn open, not by the loss of his savings, but by the theft of a single, irreplaceable memory. He had come to town for fence posts and cattle feed. He would be leaving with a purpose he hadn't sought in over a decade. He was going to get it back. The sun was a brutal hammer beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the plains. The landscape stretched on for an eternity in every direction, a monotonous tableau of scorched grass and pale, hazy sky. Samuel rode with a grim, relentless focus, his horse Atlas a sturdy bay, moving at a steady, ground-eating pace. He was no longer a rancher. He was a tracker falling back on skills he had prayed he would never need again. Sheriff Miller, a man whose ambition had long outpaced his competence, had been useless. He'd formed a posse of shopkeepers and farmhands who would likely get lost before they found a trail. "They're long gone," Samuel Miller had said, shaking his head. "It's federal marshal business now. Best you go on home and count your losses." But this wasn't about the money. The 15 years of savings were a painful blow, but the locket was a piece of his soul. The robbers had been clumsy, leaving a clear trail heading south. For 2 days, Samuel followed, sleeping little, eating less. He was a patient man, taught by the land that haste was a fool's errand. He let the trail tell its story, 3 riders pushing their horses hard, then slowing as they put distance between themselves and redemption. On the 3rd morning, he found the first sign of their unraveling. One of the horses had thrown a shoe. A few miles later, he saw where they had made a hurried, careless camp. And then the tracks diverged. 2 sets of prints continued south. A single set, heavier and more erratic, veered west toward the desolate emptiness of the Cimarron Desert. It was a strange move, a foolish one. No one went into the Cimarron unless they had to. He followed the lone track. Hours later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he saw it. A dark shape on the horizon, stark against the endless plains. As he drew closer, it resolved into the skeletal remains of a wooden wagon, its wheels shattered, its canvas top ripped to shreds by the relentless wind. It was a forgotten husk, a monument to some long-ago misfortune on the old Santa Fe trail. And slumped against it was a figure. He dismounted, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. He approached with caution, the crunch of his boots on the dry ground at the only sound. The figure was a woman no older than 25. Her dress was torn, her hair a tangled mat of dust and sweat. Her face, pale as chalk in the fading light, was a constellation of bruises, a dark purple bloom swelling one cheek. Dried blood clung to a cut on her lip. She looked as broken as the wagon she leaned against. He thought she was dead. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring through him as if he were just another part of the unforgiving landscape. He knelt, his shadow falling over her. It was only then that he recognized her. It was the woman from the bank, the one he had pulled from the path of the panicked crowd. A low, raspy sound escaped her cracked lips, a whisper so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. "I'm already dead inside." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had seen the aftermath of violence, the cold finality of death, but he had never heard despair given such a hollow final voice. He stood there, the vast, silent prairie stretching around them, feeling a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the long ride. He was a man of action, not words. He did the only thing a decent man could do. Slowly, he unbuttoned his dusty canvas shirt, the only one he had on. It was still warm from his own body, smelling faintly of horse leather and sweat. Without a word, he draped it over her trembling shoulders. She flinched a sharp bird-like movement, her eyes widening in a fresh wave of fear, as if expecting another blow. But then, as the simple warmth of the fabric seeped into her chilled skin, her body sagged. Her arms dropped, too weak to resist, too broken to care. He guided her gently away from the wreck and helped her onto Atlas, mounting behind her. He didn't ask her name, didn't press her with questions. Her eyes, filled with a pain that went far deeper than her physical wounds, had already told him more than words ever could. As they rode toward the distant, familiar silhouette of his ranch, one thought echoed in his mind, a question that any decent person would ask. What kind of monster would do this? The trail of the lone rider had led him here. The connection was undeniable. One of the bank robbers had taken this woman, brutalized her, and left her to die in the wilderness. The pursuit of his locket had become entangled with something far darker. He led her into the small Spartan guest room of his ranch house. The scent of yesterday's coffee and the dry, sweet perfume of pine floorboards hung in the air, a scent of solitude and quiet routine. He sat her on the edge of the bed and pulled a thick wool quilt over her shoulders. For a long while she just stared at the floor, silent, her body rigid, as if she was unsure whether she had been saved or merely moved from one cage to another. When Samuel returned with a bowl of warm broth, her hands shook so violently that the spoon rattled against the ceramic. He had to steady her wrist for her. She sipped, coughed, then sipped again, the simple nourishment seeming to take a monumental effort. Only after the bowl was empty did she whisper her name. Evelyn. Her voice was raw, as if it had been scraped clean by screaming. I shouldn't be here. Trouble will follow me. Samuel leaned back in the simple wooden chair he'd pulled up his large frame, filling the small space. He had learned long ago that some wounds needed silence to heal, not questions. He waited. The story came out in broken pieces between ragged breaths and trembling silences. Her husband, Thomas Carter. A blacksmith from Abilene, she said. A man with fists as heavy as the iron he forged and a temper sharpened by whiskey. His jealousy was a constant, suffocating presence. He saw betrayal in a friendly nod, infidelity in a shared glance. He would come home swinging his knuckles, finding her ribs, his belt, finding her back, his rage a storm she could never escape. The bank, in redemption. She stammered, her eyes darting to the floor. We were just passing through. He wanted to get supplies. She faltered, the lie catching in her throat. Samuel said nothing, his expression unreadable. She went on, the rehearsed parts of her story flowing more easily. Last night, he'd been drinking. He saw a man tip his hat to me at the general store. That was enough. Her voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper. He dragged me from the wagon, tore my clothes. He just kept hitting me. When she begged to be let back in, he had laughed, telling her to freeze in the cold. All she had for shelter was the broken-down wreck by the trail. That was where Samuel had found her at dawn. Samuel listened without a word, his jaw tight, his weathered hands clenching into fists on the arms of the chair. The pieces didn't quite fit. A blacksmith from Abilene happening to be in redemption during a bank robbery, the lone rider's trail leading directly to her. But the pain in her eyes, the terror etched onto her face, that was real. Whatever the whole truth was, her suffering was undeniable. Evelyn saw the look in his eyes, a hard, flinty anger that was not directed at her. For the first time, a flicker of something she dared not name hope stirred within her. But it was quickly extinguished by fear. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "You don't understand. Thomas will never let me go. He thinks I belong to him. When he finds out I'm here, he will bring hell with him." Samuel's gaze met hers. The pale blue of his eyes seemed to darken. "Let him come." He said the words low and steady. He didn't know the full shape of the danger heading his way, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The violence stopped here. This house, this land, would be a sanctuary, and he would be its unbreachable wall. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. It was a quiet born of exhaustion and unspoken fears. Evelyn slept for most of the first day, a deep, dreamless slumber that seemed to be her body's desperate attempt to mend itself. Samuel went about his chores with a quiet deliberation, his movements economical and precise. He mended the tack in the barn, his hands working the leather with practiced ease. He checked on his small herd of cattle, their placid chewing a comforting rhythm in the vast silence of the prairie. He had a man, Jebediah, an old wiry ranch hand with a face like a dried apple, who came up from his small line shack near the creek every other day. Jeb had worked for Samuel's father and had stayed on after he passed. He was more of a fixture than an employee. Jeb saw Evelyn on the second day, sitting on the porch wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts. He tipped his hat, his sharp eyes, taking in her bruised face and the haunted look in her eyes. Later in the barn, he spoke to Samuel. "Got yourself some trouble, boss," Jeb said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Trouble found its way here." Samuel corrected him, his voice flat. Jeb spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Trouble like that usually brings more of its kind along for the visit. You watch your back, Samuel. A man who'll do that to his woman ain't got no lines he won't cross." Samuel just nodded, his thoughts already miles down the road, scanning the horizon. Evelyn began to stir from her shell. She moved about the house like a ghost, at first her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She would watch Samuel from the window as he worked, her expression a mixture of fear and fascination. He was unlike any man she had ever known. His strength was not in noise or threats, but in his stillness, in the steady, capable way he moved through his world. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were direct and carried weight. "Work's gotta get done," he said one morning, finding her watching him milk the lone dairy cow. An extra pair of hands is just that. It was the closest he came to an invitation. She started with small things, sweeping the porch, tending the small vegetable garden Sarah had planted years ago. Each simple task seemed to stitch a piece of her spirit back together. The work was honest and grounding. The sun on her back didn't feel like a threat. The sweat on her brow felt earned. One afternoon, as she was helping him mend a fence, her hand brushed against a jagged piece of wood, drawing a small bead of blood. She flinched back with a sharp intake of breath, her eyes wide with a disproportionate fear. Samuel stopped, hammering, his gaze gentle. "It's just a splinter, Evelyn." She shook her head, tears welling. It's not the pain, I'm so used to being hurt that I expect it from everything now. Even the wood." He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply took her hand, his large, rough fingers surprisingly deft, as he used his pocket knife to carefully work the splinter free. He cleaned the small wound with a rag, dipped in water from his canteen, and wrapped it with a strip of cloth. His touch was firm, respectful, and utterly devoid of menace. In that small, quiet act of care, Evelyn found a kind of safety she had never known. But the peace was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river. They both knew it wouldn't last. The morning sun had barely cleared the prairie when the sound of hooves thundered across the yard. Not the steady gait of a lone rider, but the heavy, purposeful approach of a man who owned the ground he rode on. Evelyn froze in the kitchen, a dishcloth clutched in her hand. Her face went ashen. She didn't need to look out the window. She knew. A man on a powerful black stallion reined in before the porch. He was tall, dressed not in the rough clothes of a blacksmith, but in a well-tailored duster and clean boots. His face was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that were as cold and dead as river stones. A distinctive white scar, thin as a razor's cut, ran through his left eyebrow. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He had seen the rider coming from a mile off. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were hard. The man swung down from his horse, his movements fluid and confident. He smiled, a thin, predatory curving of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, rancher. My name is Thomas Carter. I believe you have something that belongs to me." His gaze slid past Samuel to the doorway, where Evelyn stood trembling, a silhouette of fear. "Wife," he said, the word dripping with possessive venom. "You've caused this good man a great deal of trouble. Come on home now. All is forgiven." Samuel didn't move. His thumb rested near the shotgun's hammer. "The lady stays where she pleases." Thomas's smile widened, becoming something chilling. "A man's property is his own, rancher, and I always come to collect what's mine. You see, she has a habit of running off. Telling wild stories, it's a sickness in her mind. I'm sure she's filled your head with all sorts of nonsense about me." He took a step toward the porch. Samuel shifted his weight, the shotgun rising slightly. The two men locked eyes, a silent battle of wills playing out in the morning sun. Thomas was testing him, measuring him. This was not the drunken, raging brute Evelyn had described. This was something far more dangerous, a man in perfect control of his own malice. "She's bruised," Samuel said, his voice dangerously low. "Looks to me like she fell into a man's fist." Thomas laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "She's clumsy, always has been. Now I won't ask again. Send her out." "No," Samuel said. The word was simple, absolute. The air grew thick with tension. Thomas's mask of civility began to crack, the cold fury in his eyes burning brighter. He looked from Samuel's weathered face to the shotgun, then back again. He was calculating the odds. Suddenly, a memory flared in Samuel's mind, sharp and clear as a lightning strike. The scar. The thin white line through the man's eyebrow. He had seen it before. In the chaotic, terrifying moments of the bank robbery, looking into the eyes of the man who had ripped Sarah's locket from his neck. It was him. The blacksmith from Abilene was a lie. The whole story was a lie. But why this elaborate deception? Thomas seemed to sense the shift in Samuel's understanding. His smile returned colder and more genuine this time. "You're a little quicker than I thought, old man. I was beginning to worry you'd lost your edge." He took a slow step back toward his horse. "This isn't over. I'll be back for what's mine. Both of you." He swung into the saddle, his movements a study in predatory grace. "Enjoy the quiet while it lasts." He wheeled the horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating dread in his wake. Samuel lowered the shotgun, his mind racing. He turned to look at Evelyn. She had crumpled against the doorframe, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The truth was out, but the questions had only just begun. She wasn't just a victim he had stumbled upon. She was a piece in a puzzle he didn't understand, a game whose rules and stakes were terrifyingly unknown. And he was standing squarely in the middle of it. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was heavier than any sound. It was filled with the weight of deceit and the chilling promise of violence. Samuel stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle his mind, working to connect the pieces. The bank robber, the stolen locket the woman left for dead, the calculating man with the familiar scar. They were all threads of the same dark tapestry. He finally turned and went inside. Evelyn was sitting at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on nothing. The terror of the morning had subsided, replaced by a hollow-eyed resignation. Samuel pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. He placed the shotgun on the table between them, a stark piece of iron in the quiet room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "His name is Thomas Carter Samuel," began his voice, flat and even. "But he's no blacksmith. He's the man who led the robbery at the bank in Redemption. He's the man who took my wife's locket." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now I think it's time you told me the real story, Evelyn. All of it." Her breath hitched. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "He made me," she whispered. "He said he'd kill me if I didn't do exactly as he said." Samuel waited, his expression unwavering. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly. The real story tumbled out as a torrent of fear and coercion. Thomas Carter was indeed the leader of the gang. She wasn't his wife. Her real name was Evelyn Hayes. She had been working as a singer in a saloon in Wichita when Thomas and his gang had passed through. He had taken a liking to her, a possessive, obsessive interest that quickly turned menacing. When she rebuffed him, he had taken her by force, making her his unwilling companion, a prisoner he dragged across the territory. "He's not just a thief," she said, her voice trembling. "He's hunting someone. He's been talking about it for months. A man from his past. A reckless mine foreman, he calls him. He said this man was responsible for the death of his family, his father and his older brother. He said he was going to find him and make him pay, not by killing him, but by taking away everything he ever loved, just like this man did to him." A cold dread, heavy and numbing, began to spread through Samuel's chest. A mine foreman. His past, the one he had buried so deep he thought it could never be unearthed, was rising from its grave. "He found out you were living here." Evelyn continued, her words rushing out now. "He read it in an old newspaper story about the Blackwood mine disaster. It mentioned the foreman, Samuel McGraw, had retired to a small ranch near Redemption. That's why he chose that bank. It was never about the money. It was about you. It was all designed to draw you out. Blackwood Mine. The name was a key that unlocked a chamber of horrors in his memory. The groan of failing timbers, the choking dust, the screams of dying men. And Sarah's face pale and still pulled from the rubble. The plan. Evelyn sobbed. The plan was for him to leave me on the trail, beaten and broken. He knew you. He knew the kind of man you were. He knew you wouldn't leave me there. He wanted me to get inside your life, to gain your trust, to make you care about me. And then he was going to come back and take me away or kill me in front of you. He wanted you to feel the loss all over again." Samuel felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a meticulously crafted piece of psychological torture, a revenge 15 years in the making. Thomas Carter had orchestrated every moment from the bank robbery to Evelyn's tearful story about a blacksmith husband. He had turned Samuel's own honor, his own decency, into a weapon against him. His father, Samuel, said the words, feeling like shards of glass in his throat. Was his father's name Silas Carter? Evelyn nodded, her eyes wide with confusion at his question. "And his brother? Was it Daniel?" "Yes," she whispered. "How did you know?" Because Samuel remembered them. Silas Carter, a greedy, reckless man who always cut corners on safety. And his son Daniel. They had both been in the shaft that day. And Thomas. Thomas must have been the younger son, the boy who had been left behind. The boy who had spent 15 years nursing a twisted version of the truth, letting his grief curdle into a black, all-consuming hatred. He stood up the chair, scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and stared out at the vast, indifferent plains that had been his refuge for so long. There was no refuge now. The past had not only found him, it had laid a siege to his very soul. Thomas Carter didn't just want his life. He wanted to dismantle him piece by painful piece. He turned back to Evelyn. Her fear was real. Her bruises were real. She was as much a victim in this as he was. A pawn in a ghost's vengeful game. He said he'd be back. Samuel said, his voice now devoid of any emotion but a grim resolve. And he will. But he's not going to find us here. This ends where it began. He walked to the hooks by the door and took down his heavy coat and his hat. He checked the action on his Colt, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. "Where are we going?" Evelyn asked, her voice small. "To a place I swore I'd never see again." Samuel replied, his eyes fixed on the distant shadowy line of the mountains to the west. "We're going to the Blackwood Mine." The journey to the Blackwood Mine was a pilgrimage into a haunted past. They rode west, leaving the familiar rolling plains behind for the rugged, broken country of the foothills. The air grew thinner, cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For 2 days they spoke little. The truth now laid bare between them was too vast and terrible for small talk. Samuel was consumed by memories, the ghosts of Blackwood riding alongside him, their silent accusations echoing in his mind. Evelyn was trapped in a different kind of silence, the silence of a pawn who has just learned the nature of the game. Samuel had sent Jeb into town with a hastily scrawled note for Sheriff Miller. It was a long shot. Miller was a fool, but his deputies might have some sense. The note was simple. "Thomas Carter, the bank robber, is heading for the old Blackwood Mine. Bring rifles." He didn't expect a rescue. He just wanted witnesses. He wanted Thomas's crimes brought into the light. As they neared the mine, the landscape became a graveyard of industry. Rusted ore carts lay on their sides like dead beetles. The skeletal remains of wooden sluices and headframes clawed at the sky. A sense of profound decay hung over the place, a silence that felt older and deeper than the quiet of the plains. The mine entrance was a gaping black mouth in the side of the mountain, a wound that had never healed. Decaying timbers, slick with moisture, framed the opening. A sign, its paint faded to illegibility, hung askew from a single nail, Blackwood Mining Sioux. "He'll be waiting inside," Samuel said, dismounting. He handed Evelyn the reins to both horses. "Take them down into that ravine. Stay hidden and stay quiet, no matter what you hear." "You're going in there alone?" she asked, her voice laced with terror. "He'll kill you." "He's been trying to kill me for 15 years, Samuel said, his face grim. "He just didn't know it. This has to be settled. Between him and me." He pulled his Colt, the familiar weight of it, a cold comfort in his hand. He took a deep breath of the damp subterranean air filling his lungs, and stepped out of the sunlight and into the abyss. Darkness enveloped him. The only light came from the entrance behind him, a pale, shrinking rectangle. The air was cold and smelled of wet rock and rot. The drip, drip, drip of water echoed from somewhere deep within, a sound like a faulty clock ticking down his final seconds. He moved forward slowly, his boots scuffing on the gravelly floor, his eyes straining to adjust to the gloom. "I knew you'd come, McGraw." The voice came from the darkness ahead, smooth and laced with triumph. It was Thomas. "I knew that petrified honor of yours wouldn't let you run." The voice continued, echoing off the rock walls. A moment later, a lantern flared to life, casting long, dancing shadows. Thomas stood about 50 feet down the tunnel, the lantern held high. In his other hand, he held a revolver. He was smiling. "Welcome home," Thomas sneered. "A fitting place for this to end, don't you think, right here in the tomb you built for my family?" "This wasn't a tomb until your father's greed made it," one Samuel said, his voice steady, refusing to let the ghosts of this place shake him. Thomas's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of rage. "Liar, you were the foreman. You were responsible for safety. You cut corners to save the company money, and my father and my brother paid the price. They were buried alive under tons of rock because of you. That's the story you've been telling yourself all these years, Samuel asked, taking a slow step forward. That's what's fueled this crusade. It's the truth. Thomas roared, the sound booming in the confined space. And you didn't just kill them. You killed your own wife. Did you forget that part? She's down here too. Her ghost is right here with us. Can you feel her? Can you hear her accusing you? The mention of Sarah was a physical blow. Samuel flinched, the old wound tearing open anew. That was Thomas's goal, to break him before the shooting even started. I live with that every day, Samuel said, his voice thick with a grief that time had not diminished. But you've got the story wrong, Thomas. You've had it wrong for 15 years. He had to try. He had to offer the truth, even if it fell on deaf ears. Your father was warned, Samuel said, his voice ringing with conviction. I told him myself. The support timbers in that south shaft were groaning. The rock was unstable. I ordered the shaft closed until we could reinforce it. But he'd found a new vein of silver, a rich one. He was blinded by it. He took your brother and 2 other men down there after I'd left for the day, against my direct orders. He ignored every safety rule we had. Thomas's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. You're lying to save your own skin. No, Samuel said, his voice dropping. I'm telling you the truth you were never told. When the first collapse happened, I was in the office. I ran back. Sarah. My Sarah was a nurse. She came with me to help the wounded. We were getting the first men out when a second tremor hit. The main tunnels started to go. I tried to get her out, but she saw your father Silas trapped under a fallen beam. She ran back to help him. Samuel's voice broke the memory, as raw as if it were yesterday. She died trying to save the man who caused it all. The roof came down. I found them both. Together. Your father's greed didn't just kill him and your brother. It killed my wife. The revelation struck Thomas with the force of a physical impact. His entire world, the entire foundation of his life's quest for revenge, crumbled in that instant. The hatred that had defined him was built on a lie. He stared at Samuel, his eyes wide with a dawning horror, the truth of poison seeping into his soul. But the poison had been there too long. His grief had twisted into something monstrous, and it couldn't be undone with mere words. His face contorted not in understanding, but in pure, nihilistic rage. If his cause was a lie, then all that was left was destruction. Liar, he shrieked, and he raised his pistol. The mine exploded with the deafening roar of gunfire. Samuel dove to the side as a bullet ricocheted off the rock wall where his head had been. He came up firing, his Colt bucking in his hand. The tunnel was filled with strobing muzzle flashes, thunderous reports, and the acrid smell of burnt powder. It was a desperate, brutal exchange in the claustrophobic darkness. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Samuel's shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain. He grunted, stumbling back against the rough-hewn wall. Thomas lunged forward, using the moment to close the distance. He brought his pistol down like a club, aiming for Samuel's head. Samuel blocked the blow with his forearm, the impact jarring him to the bone. The guns were useless at this range. It became a primal grunting struggle. A clash of 2 men broken by the same tragedy, fighting in the grave of their loved ones. Samuel was older, but his strength was that of the earth itself, solid and enduring. Thomas was wiry and fast, fueled by years of rage. They slammed against the tunnel walls, their breathing ragged. Thomas drove a knee into Samuel's ribs. Samuel answered with a powerful shove that sent Thomas stumbling backward. He tripped over a loose rock and went down hard. His pistol clattered away into the darkness. Samuel stood over him, his own gun leveled, his chest heaving. The pain in his shoulder was a raging fire. Thomas looked up from the ground, his face a mess of dirt and despair. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, shattered emptiness. The truth had finally broken him. She died, trying to save him. He whispered the question, a plea. Samuel nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She was the best of us, Thomas. And he took her. A groan of decaying timber echoed from deep within the mine, a sound of finality. The gunshots had weakened the already fragile structure. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "The whole mine is coming down," Samuel said, his voice urgent. "We have to get out." He offered a hand to the man who had tried to destroy him. Thomas stared at it, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed he might take it. Then his gaze shifted past Samuel toward the deeper darkness of the shaft, where his father and brother lay buried. A strange, serene look settled on his face. "This is my family's tomb," he said softly. "It's where I belong." The ceiling groaned again, louder this time. A large section of the tunnel behind Thomas collapsed with a deafening roar, showering them with rock and dust, cutting off any retreat. The only way out was forward, back to the entrance. Samuel turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness, driven by a primal need to see the sun again. He didn't look back. He burst out of the mine's entrance, gasping into the late afternoon light, just as the entire mountainside seemed to sigh and settle. A cloud of dust billowed from the mine's mouth, followed by a profound, final silence. The Blackwood mine had reclaimed its dead. He fell to his knees, his shoulders screaming in agony, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Evelyn was there, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. She rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. He leaned on her, the weight of 15 years, finally lifting from his shoulders, leaving behind an aching void. In the distance, he heard the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Miller and his posse. They were too late for the fight, but just in time for the aftermath. Samuel's gaze fell to his chest. Tucked into his shirt pocket, he could feel the hard, familiar outline of the silver locket. In the desperate struggle, he had managed to retrieve it from Thomas. He pulled it out. It was dented and scratched, but it was there. He clicked it open. Inside, the tiny, smiling portrait of Sarah looked up at him, her eyes full of a love that had transcended even death. He had gone into the darkness to reclaim a memory, and in doing so had finally laid the ghosts of his past to rest. The weeks that followed were quiet and marked by a slow, deliberate healing. Sheriff Miller and his men had found the mine entrance completely sealed by the collapse. They took Samuel's statement, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Thomas Carter was officially listed as buried in the cave-in, another ghost, to haunt the cursed grounds of Blackwood. The story of the bank robbery and the long-simmering revenge became a local legend whispered about in the Redemption Saloon. Back at the ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. Evelyn cared for Samuel's shoulder, her touch gentle and sure as she cleaned and dressed the wound. The roles had reversed. He was now the one in need of care, and she rose to the occasion with a quiet strength he hadn't seen in her before. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, sober calm. They were two survivors bound by a shared trauma that no one else could ever understand. They talked. Not about the mine or the robbery or the long shadow of Thomas Carter, but about simple things. About the coming winter, the stubbornness of the old mule, the way the light changed on the plains at sunset. They were rebuilding a world for themselves, one small, ordinary conversation at a time. The vast, empty spaces of the ranch house began to feel less like a monument to loss and more like a home. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of glory, Samuel sat on the porch cleaning his colt. Evelyn came and sat in the rocking chair beside him, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They watched the last of the light fade from the sky, the silence between them comfortable and deep. Samuel finished his task and set the pistol aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Sarah's locket. He had polished the silver, but the dents and scratches from the fight remained scars that told the end of its story. He held it in his palm for a long moment, his thumb tracing the intricate engravings. He looked at Evelyn, her profile soft in the twilight. "She would have liked you," he said, his voice quiet. Evelyn turned to him, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "She must have been a wonderful woman," she was, Samuel affirmed. He stood up and went inside, returning a moment later with a small carved wooden box. It was filled with the few precious mementos he had of his life with Sarah: a pressed wildflower, a faded ribbon, a handful of letters. He gently placed the silver locket inside, nestled among the other memories. He closed the lid with a soft click. It was not an act of forgetting, but of honoring. He was placing his past in a safe, respected place, no longer wearing it around his neck like a burden. He returned to the porch and sat down, not in his own chair, but on the step beside hers. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep velvet of the sky. A new day was done, and a new night was beginning. Together, they watched the darkness give way to the promise of a sunrise, their future as vast and open as the prairie before them, a quiet space where two broken souls could finally begin to build something new.